This is not just a story. This is a warning written in blood, faith, and divine judgment.
What would you do if helping the right person meant certain death, and doing nothing meant living the rest of your life with a quiet, unshakable guilt? Jerusalem was not simply tense, it was unraveling from the inside out. As whispers of discontent turned into open rebellion and loyalty became a dangerous liability overnight. A son had risen against his father, and not through a moment of anger but through calculated ambition, winning the hearts of the people with charm while quietly dismantling the authority of the throne. And at the center of this collapse stood King David, no longer surrounded by certainty and strength, but forced into a reality he could not control: a king without a kingdom, a leader without a secure future, a father betrayed by his own blood. When Absalom's coup finally ignited, it did not unfold as a dramatic clash of armies at the gates, but as a swift and suffocating shift in power that left David with only one viable choice: flee or die. There was no time to strategize, no time to negotiate, no time to reclaim control. The palace that once symbolized stability now became a trap, and staying meant certain destruction. So David did what few expected. He walked away, not with the pride of a ruler defending his crown, but with the urgency of a man trying to preserve what little remained. Barefoot, head covered in grief, he left behind the city he built, knowing that every step away from Jerusalem was a step into uncertainty, and possibly his final chapter. But David did not walk into exile alone. Behind him stretched a fragile line of loyalty servants, soldiers, and families who chose to follow a fallen king rather than align themselves with a rising tyrant. These were not naive followers blinded by hope. They understood the cost. They knew that by walking with David, they were stepping outside the protection of power and into the unforgiving reality of survival. And as the distance between them and Jerusalem grew, so did the weight of their decision. Because exile is not just a matter of geography, it is a slow erosion of strength, confidence, and hope. Food becomes scarce, sleep becomes uncertain, and the future becomes a question no one can answer. Now imagine the atmosphere among them. These were once elite warriors, men who had fought battles and won victories under David's command, now reduced to calculating how long their supplies would last and whether they would even live to see another sunrise. The wilderness does not respect titles or past achievements. It strips everything down to the most basic truth: either you endure or you collapse. And as hunger began to creep in and exhaustion settled into their bones, morale did something even more dangerous. It began to fracture, because when survival becomes the priority, belief in victory starts to feel like a luxury no one can afford. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom's influence was tightening its grip. His narrative spread quickly, reshaping perception into reality. To the public, David was no longer the chosen king. He was the defeated one, the past, the man who had already lost. And history shows us something that has never changed. People do not risk their lives for what appears to be fading. They align themselves with what looks inevitable. In moments like this, loyalty is no longer admired, it is questioned, feared, even punished. Anyone who dared to support David now risked being labeled a traitor, facing consequences that extended far beyond personal loss. Property could be seized, families could be targeted, and lives could be ended without hesitation. So most people made the choice that feels safest in times of chaos. They stayed silent. They watched from a distance, carefully avoiding any action that might tie them to the wrong side of history. They told themselves that patience was wisdom, that waiting was survival, that neutrality was the smartest path forward. And on the surface, they were right, because neutrality keeps you alive. It protects your resources, your reputation, your immediate future. But what it quietly takes from you is far more subtle and far more permanent. It erodes your sense of conviction. It teaches you to ignore the voice that tells you what is right in favor of what is safe. And once that voice is silenced long enough, it becomes harder and harder to hear it at all. Now stop and consider this, not as a distant historical scenario, but as a real decision placed in front of you. If you were living in that moment, with real consequences and no guarantee of a positive outcome, would you have helped David? Not in theory, not in an idealized version of yourself, but in reality, when fear is immediate, when risk is undeniable, when the cost is more than you are comfortable paying. Would you have stepped forward, knowing that your action could cost you everything? Or would you have remained in the background, convincing yourself that survival is the same as wisdom? Because here is where the story begins to shift in a way no one expects. At the very moment when David's situation appeared most hopeless, when he had lost his throne, his city, and nearly the morale of his people, help did not come from the powerful, the ambitious, or the strategically positioned. It came from someone far removed from the center of the conflict. Someone who had every reason to stay uninvolved. Someone who, by all conventional logic, should have chosen comfort over risk. This was not a young warrior seeking glory or a politician seeking influence. This was a man who had already lived his life, built his wealth, and earned his rest. And yet, while the majority chose silence, he chose something far more dangerous: action. But before we step into his story, hold on to this tension for a moment. Picture David and his followers again, moving slowly through the wilderness, their strength fading, their future uncertain, their hope hanging by a thread. This is not a moment of triumph, it is the edge of collapse, the point where stories usually end in defeat. And if nothing changes, that is exactly how this one would end. Because without intervention, without support, without someone willing to break the silence, David's journey would not be remembered as a temporary exile, it would be remembered as a final downfall. And that is what makes what comes next so powerful, because the turning point in this story does not begin with an army, a strategy, or a miracle. It begins with a decision. A single, deliberate choice made by someone the world was no longer paying attention to. A choice that defies logic, ignores fear, and redefines what it means to be loyal when loyalty comes at the highest possible cost. So ask yourself one more question before we move forward. What if the most defining moment of your life does not come when you are at your strongest, but when everything in the world tells you to stay still and you decide to move anyway? Because that is exactly where this story is about to go, and once you see it unfold, you may never look at the idea of courage, loyalty, or legacy the same way again. What if the most dangerous decision you could make was the one that looked completely unnecessary? Far from the chaos of Jerusalem, beyond the dust and desperation of a fleeing king, life still moved at a different pace in Gilead. The land was quieter, steadier, untouched by the immediate shockwaves of Absalom's rebellion, and in that calm lived a man who, by every reasonable standard, had already done enough with his life. His name was Barzillai, an 80-year-old man of great wealth, influence, and comfort. He was not struggling to survive, not chasing ambition, not trying to prove anything to anyone. He had reached the stage of life where most people withdraw, protect what they've built, and avoid unnecessary risks. If anyone had earned the right to remain neutral, it was him. And yet, neutrality was exactly what he could not accept, because while others saw distance from the conflict as protection, Barzillai saw it as a test. News of David's flight had reached him, not as distant gossip, but as a moral crossroads. He understood the stakes immediately. This was not just about politics or power, it was about choosing whether to stand with what was right when it was no longer safe to do so. And make no mistake, he knew exactly what helping David would mean. This was not a symbolic gesture or a quiet show of sympathy. Any act of support would be visible, traceable, and punishable. If Absalom secured his rule land at that moment, it certainly looked like Barzillai's decision could cost him everything: his wealth, his legacy, his family's security, even his life. Most people, when faced with that kind of risk, don't hesitate. They step back, they rationalize, they tell themselves that one person's action won't change the outcome. They wait to see who wins, then adjust their loyalty accordingly. It feels logical, it feels strategic, it feels safe. But Barzillai saw something most people miss in moments like this. Waiting is also a decision. And sometimes, it is the most costly one of all. Because while others were calculating probabilities, Barzillai was weighing principles. He wasn't asking, will David win? He was asking, what is the right thing to do if he doesn't? And that single shift in perspective changed everything. It removed the comfort of indecision and replaced it with clarity. If David was in need, then help was required. Not later, not conditionally, no. But conviction alone is easy in theory. The real challenge begins when conviction demands action, and in this case, action was anything but simple. Supplying David was not a matter of sending a few provisions or offering quiet support from a distance. David and his men were deep in hostile territory, cut off from reliable supply lines, constantly moving, vulnerable, exposed. Reaching them would require navigating rugged terrain, coordinating logistics under pressure, and doing so without drawing attention from forces that would interpret any such movement as treason. This was not just risky, it was operationally complex. Every step had to be calculated, every resource accounted for, every movement deliberate. And Barzillai didn't hesitate. Think about that for a moment. An 80-year-old man who could have easily remained comfortable and untouched by the crisis, instead chose to orchestrate a higher-risk supply mission into a war zone, not because he was forced to, not because he stood to gain something, but because he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He understood that influence is not measured by how much you have, but by what you are willing to do with it when it matters most. And here's where the story takes a deeper turn. Because Barzillai did not act alone, he aligned himself with others, men like Shobi and mature individuals who also recognized the weight of the moment. This was not a reckless impulse, it was a coordinated effort. Together they gathered resources, planned their approach, and prepared to deliver exactly what David's camp needed most. Not symbolic support, not vague encouragement, but tangible, life-sustaining provision. Now imagine the tension of that journey, moving through uncertain territory, fully aware that discovery could mean immediate consequences. Every sound matters, every delay increases risk, every decision carries weight. This is not a comfortable act of generosity, it's a calculated defiance of fear. And the deeper you look at it, the more unsettling the question becomes. What gave him the courage to act when others stayed silent? Because it wasn't ignorance of the danger. Barzillai understood the political climate. He knew how quickly power could shift and how brutally dissent could be punished. It wasn't desperation, he had no personal need to involve himself. And it certainly wasn't ambition, there was nothing left for him to gain. It was conviction, stripped of excuses. The kind of conviction that does not wait for certainty before acting. The kind that does not depend on outcomes to justify itself. The kind that says, even if this costs me everything, it is still worth doing. Now pause and consider how rare that is. In a world both then and now where most decisions are filtered through risk assessment, personal benefit, and social consequence, Barzillai's choice stands out as almost irrational. And yet, it is precisely that irrationality that makes it powerful, because it reveals a truth we often avoid. The most meaningful actions in life are rarely the safest ones. And here's the hook you can't ignore. What if the reason most people never create a lasting legacy is because they are always waiting for the moment when it feels safe to act? Barzillai didn't wait for that moment, he created one. He stepped into uncertainty, not because he was guaranteed success, but because he refused to let fear define his story. And in doing so, he transformed what could have been a quiet, comfortable ending to his life into something far greater, defining act of courage that would echo far beyond his years. But the decision, as powerful as it was only the beginning, because choosing to act is one thing, executing that decision in the face of real danger is something else entirely. And what Barzillai was about to deliver to David's camp would not just meet physical needs, it would ignite something far more critical. Hope. The kind of hope that can turn exhaustion into endurance, fear into resolve, and a collapsing situation into a turning point. So now the question shifts again. Not just would you act, but would you follow through when the risk becomes real? Because in the next part of this story, we're going to see exactly what that follow-through looks like, and why it changed everything. What if the difference between collapse and comeback wasn't an army, but a single act of timely support? By the time Barzillai and his allies reached David's camp, the situation was more fragile than anyone on the outside could fully understand. This was no longer just a group of displaced followers, it was a force on the verge of breaking. Hunger had dulled their strength, exhaustion had eroded their discipline, and uncertainty had begun to poison their confidence. These were men who had once stood fearless in battle, now reduced to calculating survival one day at a time. And the most dangerous part wasn't the lack of food, it was the slow disappearance of belief. Because when people stop believing they can win, they don't need to be defeated, they collapse from within. Now imagine the moment Barzillai's convoy appears on the horizon. At first, it's just movement in the distance and clear, almost insignificant, but as it draws closer, something shifts. Shapes become visible, wagons, supplies, people, and then realization hits, not as a quiet understanding, but as a surge of disbelief. Someone came, not out of obligation, not out of convenience, but out of loyalty. And what they brought with them was not symbolic, it was deeply practical, almost surgical in its precision. Scripture records the details in a way that feels surprisingly grounded. Beds for rest, basins for washing, pottery for cooking, wheat and barley for sustenance, flour and roasted grain for immediate consumption, beans and lentils for nourishment, honey for energy, curds and sheep for protein, and cheese from the herd to sustain strength over time. This wasn't random generosity, it was strategic provision. Every item addressed a specific need, every resource chosen with intention. This is where the story shifts from admirable to extraordinary, because Barzillai didn't just care, he understood. He anticipated what a displaced army would need, not just to survive, but to recover, food, to restore strength, comfort, to restore dignity, organization, to restore order. And in doing so, he delivered something far more powerful than supplies. He delivered stability. Now pause and think about that. In a moment where everything felt uncertain, where every variable pointed toward defeat, this act introduced something solid, something reliable, something real. And that changes people, because when you are surrounded by chaos, even a small sign of order can feel like a lifeline. It reminds you that not everything is lost, that not everyone has abandoned you, that the story may not be over yet. And that's exactly what happened. The arrival of those supplies didn't just feed Bodhiset reignited minds. Soldiers who had been drifting toward despair suddenly had something tangible to hold on to. Leaders who had been questioning their next move now had space to think clearly again. David himself, burdened by loss and betrayal, was reminded that loyalty still existed, that he had not been completely forsaken. And here's the part most people miss. The psychological impact of that moment was greater than the physical one, because food can sustain you for a day but hope can carry you through a war. This was the turning point no one saw coming. Not a dramatic victory, not a sudden reversal, but a quiet, decisive shift in momentum. The kind that doesn't make noise, but changes everything beneath the surface. The kind that turns a losing situation into a fighting chance. And yet, the risk behind that moment never disappeared, because every item delivered, every wagon unloaded, every visible act of support came with a cost. News travels quickly in times of conflict, and acts like this do not remain hidden for long. Barzillai had effectively declared his position not through words, but through action. He had aligned himself with David in a way that could not be denied or reinterpreted. If Absalom's rule solidified, there would be no plausible deniability, no quiet retreat back into neutrality. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back. Now ask yourself this: would you still act if you knew your decision couldn't be undone? If your support for something right permanently placed you at risk? Because that's the level of commitment we're looking at here. This wasn't a temporary gesture, it was a defining stance, one that could reshape not only Barzillai's future, but the future of everyone connected to him. And yet, there is no indication of hesitation, no sign of regret, only action, followed through to its full weight, which leads us to a deeper realization, one that reaches far beyond this ancient story. Most people underestimate the power of timely support. They think impact comes from grand gestures, massive resources, or dominant strength. But often, the most decisive factor is something far simpler, showing up at the exact moment when it matters most. Not early, when it's easy. Not late, when it's safe. But precisely when the need is greatest and the risk is highest. That's what Barzillai did. He didn't just give, he intervened. And that intervention changed the trajectory of the entire situation. Now imagine if he hadn't. If he had chosen neutrality. If he had waited. If he had convinced himself that someone else would step in. The outcome might have been very different, because without that moment of restoration, without that injection of strength and hope, David's forces may not have recovered in time, and history would have taken another path. That's how close this story is to a different ending. One decision, one act, one moment, and everything shifts. So here's the hook you need to sit with before we move forward. What if the reason some battles are won has nothing to do with the people fighting them, and everything to do with the people who choose to support them? Because that's the role Barzillai stepped into, not the warrior, not the king, but the one who made victory possible. And in doing so, he redefined what it means to matter in a moment of crisis. But the story doesn't end here. Because when the battle finally concludes, when the dust settles and the outcome is decided, something unexpected happens. Something that reveals even more about Barzillai's character than his courage ever could. Because it's one thing to risk everything. It's another thing entirely to walk away from the reward. And what Barzillai does next will challenge everything you think you know about legacy, success, and what it truly means to finish well. What if the ultimate proof of your character isn't what you're willing to risk, but what you're willing to refuse? The conflict did not last forever. What once felt like an unstoppable uprising began to fracture under the weight of its own instability. Strategies clashed, loyalties shifted again, and in the end, the rebellion that had driven David into exile collapsed. Absalom's rise, as sudden as it was powerful, met a decisive and irreversible end, and just like that, the narrative flipped. The fugitive king became the restored ruler. The man who had fled barefoot returned with authority, and those who had waited in silence now faced a new reality, one where their neutrality would be remembered, and their hesitation quietly exposed. Victory has a way of revealing everything. It reveals who stood firm, who disappeared, and who calculated their loyalty based on outcome. And David, now returning to reclaim his throne, did not forget. He could not forget. Because in his lowest moment, when power had abandoned him and the future looked uncertain, there were names that stood out. Faces that appeared not when it was convenient, but when it was dangerous. And among those names, one carried particular weight. Barzillai now imagined that meeting, the king restored and victorious, standing before the man who had supported him when he had nothing left to offer in return. This is not a casual encounter. This is a moment charged with gratitude, recognition, and the unspoken understanding that without Barzillai's intervention, things might have turned out very differently. So David does what any ruler, any grateful leader would do. He offers a reward, not a small token, not a passing acknowledgement, but an invitation into the center of power itself. He invites Barzillai to come with him to Jerusalem, to live in the royal court, to be sustained and honored in the presence of the king. This is more than generosity, is elevation, a chance to step into influence, comfort, and recognition at the highest level. For most people, this would be the moment they've been waiting for, the payoff, the validation, the transition from risk to reward. And after everything Barzillai had done, no one would question his acceptance. In fact, most would expect it, because this is how the world usually works. You take a risk, you receive a reward, you invest, you collect, you sacrifice, you are compensated. It feels fair, it feels right, it feels complete. But Barzillai does something no one expects. He refuses. And not out of false humility, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. At 80 years old, Barzillai understands something that many spend their entire lives chasing without ever grasping. He knows what matters to him, and, more importantly, what no longer does. He speaks with a grounded honesty that cuts through the illusion of prestige. He acknowledges his age, his limitations, his stage in life. The pleasures of the royal court, the music, the food, the influence hold no real appeal for him anymore. They are not wrong, not meaningless, but simply not his. And this is where the story becomes deeper than courage, because it shifts from what he was willing to risk to what he was unwilling to take. Think about how rare that is. Most people don't struggle with recognizing opportunity, they struggle with refusing it, especially when it comes wrapped in honor, gratitude, and well-deserved reward. Saying no in that moment requires a different kind of strength. Not physical courage, not strategic thinking, but internal alignment. The ability to say, this may be good, but it is not right for me. Barzillai chooses to return home, to his land, his people, his community, the place where his life has meaning beyond recognition. He does not see Jerusalem as an upgrade, he sees it as a distraction from what truly matters to him at this stage of his life. And in doing so, he redefines success in a way that challenges everything the world typically celebrates. Because success, in this moment, is not about gaining more, it is about knowing when you already have enough. But Barzillai's refusal is not an act of withdrawal, it is an act of transition. Because he doesn't just walk away, he redirects the opportunity. Instead of taking the king's offer for himself, he asks that it be given to Chimham, a younger man, likely his son. This is not just generosity, it is legacy in motion. Barzillai understands that while his season of stepping forward into risk may be concluding, the next generation is just beginning theirs. And rather than holding on to influence, he passes it forward. Now pause and consider the layers of that decision. He risked everything when it was dangerous. He refused reward when it was offered. And he invested in someone else when he could have secured more for himself. That is not a single act of integrity. That is a pattern of it. And here's the hook you need to sit with. What if true legacy isn't built by what you accumulate, but by what you're willing to release? Because Barzillai's story doesn't end with applause or recognition. It ends with something far more enduring, a life that aligned action, conviction, and restraint into a single, coherent narrative. A life that did not chase significance, but embodied it. And David honors that. Not just with his offer, but with his memory. Because stories like this don't disappear. They become reference points. They become standards. They become the quiet benchmarks against which other lives are measured. But here's where it becomes personal again. Because it's easy to admire this kind of integrity from a distance. It's inspiring, even motivating. But when you bring it into your own life, the questions become sharper, more uncomfortable. Would you act when it's risky? Would you give when it's costly? And then would you refuse when it's rewarding? Because most people might say yes to the first two, at least in theory. But the third, that's where clarity is tested. That's where identity is revealed. Barzillai didn't just know what he stood for, he knew what he didn't need. And that is a level of self-awareness that turns actions into legacy. Now, as we move into the final part of this story, everything comes together not just as history, but as a blueprint. Because what Barzillai demonstrates is not confined to ancient conflict or royal politics. It speaks directly into the modern world, where loyalty is often transactional, courage is often conditional, and legacy is often misunderstood. And the final question isn't about him anymore. It's about you. Because once you understand what he did, you can't unsee what it requires. What if the greatest threat to your legacy isn't failure, but comfort? Barzillai's story doesn't end in the ancient hills of Gilead. It echoes into every era where people are forced to choose between what is safe and what is right. And if you think this is just a distant, historical moment, take a closer look at the world today. The landscape may have changed. There are no kings fleeing through wilderness, no visible coups unfolding in city gates, but the underlying dynamics are exactly the same. Power still shifts, narratives still control perception, and most importantly, people still face the same internal conflict: speak or stay silent, act or wait, risk or retreat. We live in a time where loyalty is often conditional. It's tied to outcomes, convenience, and personal benefit. People align themselves with what is trending, what is rising, what appears to be winning. Support is given when it is visible and rewarded, withdrawn when it becomes inconvenient or risky. And in that environment, something subtle begins to happen. Integrity becomes negotiable. Not because people are inherently dishonest, but because the system quietly trains them to prioritize safety over conviction. Now think back to Barzillai. He didn't operate within that framework. He didn't wait to see how things would unfold before deciding where he stood. He didn't measure his actions based on potential return. He acted from a place that most people avoid because it offers no guarantees. Principle, and that's what makes his story so confronting, because it forces you to ask a question that's difficult to answer honestly. Are your decisions driven by conviction or by calculation? Here's the reality: most people don't want to admit calculation feels smarter. It protects you, it minimizes loss, it keeps options open, but it also keeps you from ever fully committing to anything that matters. You become adaptable, flexible, strategically neutral, and while that might help you survive, it rarely helps you build something meaningful, because legacy is not built on neutrality. It is built on decisive moments where you choose a side, knowing there is a cost attached. Now here's where it becomes even more relevant in today's world. We often associate impact with scale. We think you need a large platform, significant resources, or widespread influence to make a difference. But Barzillai's story dismantles that idea completely. He wasn't the king, he wasn't the general, he wasn't even part of the battlefield. And yet, his action became the turning point. Why? Because he understood timing. He showed up when it mattered most. And that's something anyone can do. You may not control the outcome of a situation. You may not have the power to change the entire system. But you always have the ability to step in at the right moment, to provide what is needed, to support when others step back. And often that is enough to shift everything. But here's the hook you can't ignore. What if the reason you haven't made the impact you're capable of is not because you lack ability, but because you've been waiting for a risk-free moment that will never come? Barzillai didn't wait for that moment. He acted in the middle of uncertainty. And that's what separates people who are remembered from those who are not. Now let's take it one step further. Because his story doesn't just challenge how you act, it challenges how you finish. In modern culture, there's a quiet assumption that aging means stepping back. That as you get older, your role becomes smaller, safer, more detached from risk. You've done your part. You've earned your rest. And while there is truth in the value of rest, there is also a danger in believing that your most meaningful contributions are behind you. Barzillai proves the opposite. At 80 years old, he didn't fade into the background. He stepped into one of the most defining moments of his life, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. And in doing so, he shattered the idea that relevance is tied to age. Relevance is tied to willingness. The willingness to engage, to care, to act when it would be easier not to. And that's a message that cuts across generations. Whether you are young and waiting for your opportunity, or older and questioning your role, the principle remains the same. Your impact is not determined by your stage in life, but by your readiness to respond when it matters. But then comes the final layer, the one most people overlook. Barzillai didn't just act courageously, he exited wisely. When the reward was offered, he didn't cling to it. He didn't leverage his actions for personal gain. He didn't extend his influence beyond what was meaningful to him. Instead, he redirected the opportunity to the next generation. And that's where legacy becomes complete. Because legacy is not just about what you do, it's about what continues after you. It's about whether your actions create space for others to step forward, or whether they revolve entirely around your own recognition. And in a world that constantly pushes for more success, more visibility, more accumulation, that kind of restraint is rare. So here's the final question, the one that brings everything together. When your moment comes, will you recognize it? And will you act? Not when it's easy, not when it's safe, but when it actually matters. Because moments like that don't announce themselves. They don't come with guarantees or clear outcomes. They arrive quietly, often disguised as inconvenience, risk, or disruption. And in that moment you either step forward or you don't. Barzillai stepped forward. He risked when others hesitated. He gave when others withheld. He refused when others would have taken, and in doing so, he built something that outlasted wealth, power, and even his own lifetime. A legacy defined not by what he had, but by what he chose to do with it. So as this story ends, it leaves you with something more than inspiration. It leaves you with a challenge. Because now you know what it looks like. And once you know, the responsibility changes. The next time you find yourself in a moment where silence feels safer than action, where waiting feels wiser than stepping forward, where the cost feels too high to justify the risk, remember this story, not as history, but as a mirror. Because the question is no longer what Barzillai did. The question is what you will do when it's your turn. What if your entire life is quietly moving toward one moment, and you won't recognize it until it's already in front of you? Barzillai's story doesn't end with applause, recognition, or a dramatic closing scene. There is no grand celebration recorded, no monument built in his name, no public declaration that immortalizes his courage. And yet, that's exactly what makes it powerful. Because his legacy was never dependent on visibility, it was secured the moment he chose conviction over comfort, action over silence, and purpose over personal gain. And that should unsettle you a little, because it means the moments that define you won't necessarily look important when they arrive. They won't feel like turning points, they won't come with certainty. They will feel inconvenient, risky, unclear, easy to ignore, just like the moment Barzillai faced. When news reached him about a fleeing king, he could have dismissed it as someone else's problem. He could have told himself he was too old, too removed, too comfortable to get involved. He could have done what most people did, nothing. And no one would have blamed him. No one would have questioned his decision. He had every excuse to remain neutral, but he didn't. And that's the line that separates a life that is simply lived from a life that is remembered. Now here's the part that changes everything. Barzillai didn't know how the story would end. He didn't know David would return to the throne. He didn't know there would be a reward. He didn't know his actions would be recorded, remembered, and retold generations later. All he knew was what was right in front of him, a need, a risk, a decision. And that's exactly how your defining moments will appear. Not as a full picture, but as a single choice. Do you step in or step back? Do you speak or stay silent? Do you act or wait? Because waiting will always feel justified. There will always be more information to gather, more clarity to seek, more certainty to hope for. But here's the truth, most people learn too late. Clarity rarely comes before action. It comes after. Barzillai acted without guarantees, and that's what gave his decision weight. That's what turned a simple act of provision into a defining moment of legacy. Because when you remove the certainty of outcome, what remains is the purity of your intent. An intent, when followed by action, becomes identity. Now imagine if he had chosen differently, if he had waited just a little longer, if he had convinced himself that someone else would step in, if he had prioritized safety over conviction. His life would still have been comfortable, still respected, still successful by most standards. But it would have been missing the one thing that gives a life depth, a moment that proves who you really are. And that's what this comes down to. Not success, not recognition, not even impact in the way we usually measure it, but identity. Who are you when it matters? Because it's easy to define yourself when the stakes are low. It's easy to stand for something when there's no cost attached. But when the pressure rises, when the outcome is uncertain, when the risk becomes real, that's when your true self is revealed. Barzillai didn't become courageous in that moment. He revealed that he already was. And that's the final hook you need to hold on to. What you do in your moment of decision doesn't create your character, it exposes it. So if you want to understand your future, don't just look at your plans, look at your patterns. Do you avoid risk, or lean into it when it matters? Do you wait for certainty, or move with conviction? Do you hold tightly to what you've built, or release it when something greater is at stake? Because those patterns are already shaping the moments that will define you, and those moments are coming. They may not look like a fleeing king in the wilderness. They may not involve life or death stakes, but they will matter more than you expect. And when they arrive, you won't have time to become someone else. You will act as the person you already are. So here's how this story stays with you, not as history, but as a question that doesn't go away. When your moment comes, will you recognize it? And more importantly, will you have the courage to act before it passes? Because in the end, legacy is not built over a lifetime of comfort. It is forged in a handful of decisions where you choose what is right, even when it costs you everything. And when that moment comes for you, there will be no audience, no guarantees, no second chances, just a choice. and that choice will define you.